Good afternoon. I'd like to call the meeting to order of the Ordinance Committee to discuss proposed amendments to Chapter 4.52 of the Purchasing Code. May we have a roll call?
Mayor Pro Tem Rouse.
Here.
Mayor Murillo.
Here.
Madam Chair Snedden.
Here. And with that, I would like to invite staff presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm Bill Hornung, the General Services Manager. I did prepare a very short presentation, and then if you don't have the handouts, I printed out copies for you because I figured if you have any specific questions, we can go through the, this is actually the changes to the ordinance.
We do have changes to the ordinance in our packet.
Okay. How I start this thing. Top one. This is in the right place. We're trying to accomplish 5 things by updating the ordinance. It's been a number of years since we've updated it, and at that time the main focus was to increase our bidding thresholds, and there's been some unintended consequences on that. So what we're trying to do is one is clarify what are the exceptions to the competitive bid process, clarify the authority and approval requirements for things that are what we call informal bids, so that's $75,000 or less. That requirement used to be $25,000 and we increased it to $75,000. So that created some confusion among staff. Excuse me. We also want to update the cooperative purchasing section to allow the use of federal contracts. We're not real explicit on that. And the federal, GSA is the General Services Administration. They have what they call schedules. A lot of those schedules can be set up for emergency contracts, like if we're having a fire, flood, earthquake, etc. And I'll go into a little bit more detail, but it's a good idea and I think a good practice to have explicit permission to use these federal contracts. And what's come up with our auditors is that they're going to start looking at our compliance for when we get federal grants. So they also want to see our policies and procedures, what we're doing to stay in compliance and keep informed staff. So I've added some language in there about federal uniform guidance requirements, because regardless of the source, there's a set of contract language they want in all their contracts. And if you don't have those, they can ask for their money back. Or like with the FEMA, they can give us money, and when they audit us, if we're not in compliance, we're at risk of losing those funds. So I'm trying to beef up that area as well. I think some of the documents, I called it universal guidance, but I'm going to change that to uniform because that seems to be more of a common term. And then also, we wanted to streamline the purchasing process during federal declared emergencies. Because what happens when you have an emergency, when it's a federally declared emergency, you have to follow the more stringent of your own purchasing policies or the federal policies, and that can lead to errors where we might make some mistakes that could jeopardize our funding. So I think if we have an emergency, we'd like to have the option to follow the federal requirements, because with the federal requirements have a lower threshold than we do for what they call micro purchases that do not require any competition. And we have a lower threshold for when we have to do it like advertise formal competition. So I'd rather just follow the federal requirements. I think with that, we could go through the proposed changes to see if you have any specific questions.
Thank you. Do we first have any questions from the committee?
No.
I I have a question just before we go into the details. On the first page of the agenda report, it talks about council-declared emergencies. And so I had questions about, would the council need to formally declare an emergency, or in the changes that you're talking about with federally declared emergencies? How does that play in?
I thought we changed that. We're looking, it started off with council-declared emergencies that could roll up into a federal. And actually, that probably should have been corrected, because when I worked with Sarah, we decided to say federal declared emergencies, because like we had with the recent mudslide, we didn't declare our emergency, but the county did, and then it went to federal.
That was my question. So that would be a change in the agenda report. Instead of council declared, it would say
Correct.
federally declared?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I gotta find that. Thanks.
It's page 1.
Yeah, I found
It's
it.
just in the agenda report, so I
Yes.
wasn't sure. Okay.
We started off that way in the ordinance, we changed it, and I messed it in the agenda report.
Are there changes throughout the ordinance that you'd like to highlight for us? Or just what we've seen?
Well, the bigger changes, we always had an operational emergency where departments could declare emergency. And I guess the best example, if at the water treatment plant, if a critical piece of equipment fails, they need to get it repaired, and there may not be time to follow our normal competitive process. We didn't have a definition for operational emergency, so we added that. The other big thing is 4.52025 grants. That's, departments receive grants, and purchasing may or may not be aware that they're spending grant funds. So I wanted to put some language in there, and I'm going to be following up with departments doing training. It's their responsibility to communicate any special requirements if the purchase is going to go through the purchasing department. Otherwise, we could run afoul of the grant requirements. I think some of the things I added for exceptions to the competitive process, to me, kind of makes sense. If you're going to buy a book or periodical, we can't really do a bid for that. And there could be some more expensive memberships. So I put that in there as well. Typically, people build that into their budget process. Occasionally, we have purchases from other government entities, so I excluded that because that gets, they typically won't respond to a bid situation.
While we're on that page, could you give a little bit more detail about software licenses, maintenance, and that was particularly highlighted throughout?
The main thing the previous versions excluded software licenses, and it's not, when we initially go out to buy a system like the Tyler Munis system, for example, we do a competitive process. But once we purchase it and we need to renew the license, we can't really go out and do another competitive action. Also, we buy maintenance from them, and typically there's not third parties that can do the software update. So I just wanted to be real specific that we're excluding those type of items from the competitive process. But we also added a commercial off-the-shelf software. If you're buying, I don't care if you're buying an Excel, a spreadsheet, it's hard to base, I want to buy the cheapest one. It doesn't necessarily make sense because you want to look at how it fills, the look and feel of it, and kind of how it operates, because they may do the same thing, but how they do it can make a big difference. I guess the biggest changes is to section 4.52060. That's contracts up to $75,000. Previously, it didn't have a lot of language in it because the previous threshold was $25,000, which happened to be the amount of authority, or is under the authority delegated to the city administrator. So it was pretty easy if you're what to do with exceptions. When we increased that to $75,000, it created some ambiguity because you could have contracts that are above what's delegated to the city administrator. And since all those issues were addressed in the formal bidding section, we just took that as a template and moved them into the informal section. for the most part. The only thing we left in there, if we have a tie quote, we added that would go to the city council to decide how to break a tie. I don't think I've seen that yet, but you never know. It does happen occasionally. And then as we kind of talked about earlier, we added the section to 4.52080 in response. We beefed up the response to operational emergencies and added the definition for that. I wonder if we should rename the other section.
Madam Chairman, if I could just, in response to your question about council declared emergency, as I'm looking at the changes we're suggesting to the ordinance, and Bill just noted, I see that we, under 4.52.085, I noted that we still retain the title of that section, council declared emergency, where we've expanded the actual language here to encompass emergencies declared by federal, state, or local agencies. So I think we're going to recommend changing the title of that section also.
Very good, thank you.
So I'll just work on that.
I think those are the most significant changes, so unless you have, I'm glad to answer any questions you might have.
Questions from the committee?
I'll ask a question.
Mayor Murillo?
Thank you, Madam Chair. So, Mr. Hornung, good to see you. Can you talk to us about, in our council agenda report, item number 7, there's something called the state of California's debarment list and the federal excluded parties list. So sometimes these vendors, they get in trouble for some reason?
Yes.
Can you explain that?
That kind of ties back if we're getting federal funds, and it's a good practice. The state maintains a list on their website of vendors that are debarred, and typically it could be things if they have wage violations, the bribery. It's a whole host of things they could do where the state will debar them. The federal government has what they call an excluded parties list, and I have links to both of these things on purchasing's website, so staff can check. But the federal has firms that are debarred by any agency and the federal agency, and they compile a list in a centralized place. So before we award a contract, we always require them to make sure we don't have a bad actor that we're trying to award a contract to.
Thank you.
Does that conclude your report?
Yes.
Okay, and that concludes our questions.
I think so. I'm ready to make a motion.
Do we have any public comment, Madam Clerk? Okay, so seeing none, we are ready for a motion.
Thank you. I move, we heard the presentation, that we recommend this approval to City Council with the proposed changes.
Second.
Does that motion include the changes to?
With the changes
Okay.
that we identified today.
Okay, then I think we're ready to take a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you.
That passes
Good,
unanimously.
thanks.
Thank you. And with that, we are adjourned.